So uh, what I realized after this morning session is there's a lot of info. Um, and so I figured I'd help you out by leaving you with something you can take with you. Okay, the key summary points. All right. However, nonetheless, what I would really encourage, all right, and for those interested, I do have a couple copies back there. We can also order more. This is from Bishop Robert Barron, his Word on Fire Press. This is on IVF, written by a good friend of mine, Stephanie Gray Connors. My first year in the seminary, second year, anyway, 2002. This young woman came to give a pro-life presentation, how to effectively make the case for life with compassion. It was based on her book called Love Unleashes Life, which is also the name of her website, which is also at the bottom of the page in the handout you'll get. Worth checking out. Okay. We struck up a friendship, continued to talk and move on, and lo and behold, many years later, not only was she at my ordination, but she has continued to produce wonderful and helpful works to help the everyday person understand the why behind the what of some of the church's difficult moral teachings, but especially with a compassionate heart. She is, I believe, the absolute master of finding the right story to make the point, but also of telling it in such a wonderful way. If anyone is a fan of Matthew Kelly, you will love Stephanie Gray. While he is more spiritual and she gets into the logic and thinking, she does so in simple language that you won't be left behind. And that's why, again, I can't recommend on IVF enough. The wonderful part is everything she gives in here, all the stories, all the facts, it's all documented in the back of the book. So she cites her sources. So you can realize she's not making this stuff up. We're not pulling it out of thin air. So again, can't recommend Stephanie Gray Connors, her website, loveunleasheslife.com. Click on the Apologetics tab. She has many YouTube videos you can watch, podcast interviews, really a great resource, a beautiful woman, and one who knows the pain of infertility, which is at the heart of what we're talking about tonight. We ended up choosing a very vague title. It was actually supposed to be IVF and the Beginnings of Human Life. The first part got left out. But what we're talking about tonight is a deeply painful subject for many women. She got married when she was 40, not by choice. I remember for over a decade, she kept lamenting to me, when am I going to find, why can't I find a husband? Why can't I find my Joseph? And eventually she, in God's good time, did. She literally found Joe Connors. She found her Joseph, and yet ended up having a miscarriage with her first child. And then several more. Okay, and she kept having friends encourage her, hey, have you thought about naprotechnology, going to a naprotechnology doctor looking to see if there are underlying causes? And she kept resisting, no, I'm fine, this can't be it. And lo and behold, she finally did, and they were looking at the progesterone levels. At normal 3 months, everything was good. And then she just, on a whim, sneaky suspicion, went back next week and said, could you check again? And instead of going up, the level had stayed the same. And so a doctor said, come back next week. They did another test. It had actually gone down. Okay, and that was the sign that something wasn't right. We live in a world touched by original sin. Things are not always as they should be. Okay? And it's okay to assist the fertility that God has given us, provided we do so in a way that respects the dignity of the human person. That's what you're going to ultimately find tonight, that the lens with which we look at this is charity, truth and charity, compassion, but not allowing the emotion of compassion to overwhelm reason to the point that we do evil in order to accomplish a good. Throughout our Catholic history, in the very teachings of Jesus, while he doesn't use the words, you do see the reality of the moral principle. The end does not justify the means. And so what we're talking about tonight is the right means to the good end. And the question before us is in vitro fertilization a right means to the good end of a child? And if not, why? But first, a little more on the very real pain of infertility, and especially some words of counsel and wisdom to be careful. Okay. Again, the goal of my talk here is certainly not to condemn those who chose an IVF, okay, or to bring shame upon children who've been conceived through IVF. My goal is to offer truth and charity, and also to help us learn how to do the same. But this infertility is a real cross. I remember talking a couple of conversations with Stephanie and hearing of her great pain. And in fact, if you go on loveunleasheslife.com, you can read her video blogs where she talks about and shares what she's going through, but also offers hope in the midst of all that. Because infertility is an invisible cross. It's not like some sort of test strip. It's not like the little pH strips, you stick them in your antifreeze, your aquarium. Oh, look, it's acidic. Oh, look, it's basic. It's not like the pregnancy test. Okay. People don't outwardly show that there's a fertility problem. And so because it's an invisible cross, it can also be a very painful cross. And we want to be careful about jumping to assumptions that just because a couple doesn't have children or has maybe only one child or two children, we shouldn't assume that they're opposed to life or to having children. In fact, it can be an incredibly painful cross. And, I remember, reading, there's a couple stories that are shared in here where she talks about a woman who was, having difficulty with family and relatives. Every time she went to her party, everyone was asking, oh, when are you going to have children? When are you going to have children? And, the frustration, you could hear her. She's like, she wanted to say, hey, we're trying. It's not for a lack of wanting. All right. In the same way, another, again, true shared experience in an interview with Stephanie, another woman shared how there was an older woman at her church who came up and said, when are you going to have children? Or, only one was another comment that, again, broke the heart. of these parents who wanted to have more children, especially the women, very sensitive to that, very much desiring the gift of life and yet being unable to find it. Okay, so just to be careful. But what happens when someone does reveal their struggles? What helps? First of all, just to listen. Okay, listening goes a long way. Right? To sometimes people just need to be heard. Right? So to listen to them as they share their story with you, and when that's done, or when they share this intimate secret and pain and cross, just to ask, what would be most helpful to you right now? What would be most helpful to you right now? You may find they say, you've already done it, you've listened. Or, I just need you to be here with me. I just need you to understand. I just need you to be there with me. Okay, and that's enough. You don't necessarily need to say anything. But again, asking that question, what would be most helpful to you? Again, is that compassionate response, because it's giving them the freedom to let you know what they need. Now, some, perhaps not those gathered here, but perhaps some of you kind of wrestle with this question in your heart, or know someone who has. Ask the question, why are we even discussing this? Isn't all life good? Okay. And as Catholics, we would say yes. Okay. Human life is always good, regardless of how it comes into existence. Right? However, our yes, as you just heard, comes with a but. We are yes, but. All life is good, but. Right? The ideal is bringing that life into existence in the right way. All life is good, but not all life comes into existence in a good manner. And we know this is obvious. Okay. We, in fact, there's a true story here, surrogate mother, right? As the pregnancy went on, it was determined that the child that was developing had a genetic anomaly. The parents wanted her to have an abortion. She refused. Okay? She recognized the good of the child. All right? That child brought into existence. Okay? The child is good, even if necessarily the means was not. We hear of cases of rape and incest. In fact, Stephanie shares the story of her friend Ryan, who was conceived in rape. Again, a wonderful gift of a human being, unique, precious, unrepeatable, yet certainly none of us would condone the evil of rape, okay, nor incest. Right? We probably have family members who, or know people who, got pregnant when they were in high school, or before they were married, or while they were engaged. Okay? All of this is against the way God designed it. But certainly we wouldn't say those children are bad just because the means by which they came into existence was a sin. Right? To call a spade a spade. All right. So again, all life is good, but not all life is brought into existence in a good way. So what we are looking to ask is the question of, what is the good to be done? What is morally good, a morally good way of bringing life into existence, and what is not? Many years ago, I think this 2008, I believe. Yeah, September. Oh, 88. Sorry. Wow, that was a long time ago. I remember reading this in seminary. Okay. Actually, I remember I was in college when this came out. I was in grad school. Anyway, Dignity of a Person, September 8th, 1988. All right. Talking about reproductive technologies at that time. Okay. Come a long way since, but it was in vitro fertilization was just beginning to be addressed. And this was the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, now I think called the Dicastery for Faith. Again, it's a good summary of the moral principles, but it's going to read beautiful and yet at the same time sounding a little bit like a university textbook. But just to share a few of the beautiful passages that set forth the principles. So in the very beginning, okay, uh, it states the key principles by which we understand the human person. It says the body of a human being from the very first stages of its existence can never be reduced merely to a group of cells. Okay? The great irony of IVF is that it ultimately argues for life beginning with fertilization. Okay? Now, what is fertilization, you may say? Okay? Isn't that conception? How is that different from conception? Conception is where the sperm meets the egg. Fertilization takes place more or less 12 hours afterwards. Okay, so it's when that DNA of the sperm and the DNA of the egg unite so that you have a unique genetic identity. That's the moment of fertilization. All right, that's the moment we as Catholics say, well, you have to protect, because as far as we know, there's a person there. All right. When does the soul get infused? Don't know. Okay. It's not like, it turns blue or something when the soul is infused. All right. But what we do know is there's a unique genetic identity. We give presumption for the beginning of life, for the presence of the soul, for a unique human person. Right? So fertilization technically is the beginning of the human person. And you might ask, well, it just looks like a cell or a clump of cells. Yes, all of us at the very beginning of our life looked like a clump of cells. Right? But getting into beyond that is beyond the scope of the talk. So want to stay a little bit focused. But again, continuing to paragraph 8, and this is where we talk about the beginning of the dignity of the human person. The CDF states, man has unassailable value, right? We are treasures of infinite value, right? And this value belongs to all without distinction. By virtue of the simple fact of existing, every human person must be fully respected. Okay. At every stage of his existence, man, created in the image and likeness of God, reflects the face of his only begotten Son. In short, life is always a good, for it is a manifestation of God in the world, a sign of his presence, a trace of his glory. The last part quoting St. John Paul, the Gospel of Life. Okay, so paragraph 10, by what authority is the church get involved in this? The church, by expressing an ethical judgment on some developments of recent medical research, does not intervene in the area proper to medical science, but rather calls everyone to ethical and social responsibility for their actions. Okay, the church isn't getting involved in science. The church is calling for morality regarding the use of science. Okay, there always has to be ethics. Science isn't morally neutral. Okay, the research may be, the facts may be. However, how that information is used, how that technology is used, that requires questions of morality. And in that, the church, by Jesus' moral teaching, does have the authority to speak. Okay. So, moving then into the focus of tonight's talk, we're obviously going to be looking at in vitro fertilization through the Catholic Christian lens. Okay, really, I say Christian worldview because Catholicism is the fullness of Christianity. Right? That's just reality. Okay, helping others to understand that's part of our mission of evangelization. But the question then becomes means versus ends. All right, is a parent justified in seeking a child by in vitro fertilization? Right? We often talk about the rights of parents to have a child. All right, but we have to be very careful when we're talking about the rights of parents to a child. All right, do the parents have a right to demand the child? That's a question. I would ask another question. Does a person have a right to own another person? I think we can all recognize that slavery is wrong, right? Why is it wrong? Because it involves possessing another person. It involves treating a person as property, right? So the question is, are the children of parents property? I think most of us would recognize no. So when do the parents have a right to a child? When is that violated? When a government steps in to regulate the number of children or to regulate the rights of the parents to be open to God's gift of life, that's when the rights of the parents come in. And in modern times, we've seen that right violated. Most obvious example, which actually pertains to IVF as well, is China's one-child policy. Okay, what happened as a result of the one-child policy? Well, you had some who just violated it and tried to, sneak and hide their children, and to some extent, there was some success. Okay. However, if the child was found, there was also death. But more commonly, if a woman was pregnant and the child was not a boy, since boys tended to be preferred by the culture, it was not uncommon for an abortion to occur, right? But because of this gender preference, what ended up happening is you ended up with a great predominance of boys with regard to girls. So there's a gender imbalance in China, right? And what happens, and what has happened, is that there's a whole market for brides for Chinese husbands, human trafficking, okay, and sometimes with horrible consequences, right? So again, we recognize that, it's always wrong to treat a person as an object, all right? So what then are the rights of the parent? Do a parent have rights with regard to their children? Yes. They have the right to protect the child. So the rights of the parents with regard to children are oriented to the good of the child. They have the right to protect the child from harm. good example from Stephanie's book. She says, if someone breaks into your home and steals something you've purchased with your money, okay, you have the right to seek retribution. Why? Your property was unjustly taken. What if somebody breaks into your home and kidnaps your child? Okay, you have a right to seek retribution, not because the child was your property, but because the child was harmed. All right? The child has a right to life and to the loving environment of the parents. The rights of the parents are to uphold and protect those rights. All right? So kidnapping is first and foremost an injustice to the child, whereas stealing property is first and foremost a violation to the parents, or the the owners, or the person. Okay, so again, if we don't have the right to a fellow human person, how do we view each other? How should we view the child? Right, and this gets to the church's teaching contained in the dignity of a person and throughout the church's history, that the child should be viewed as a gift. Okay, but what is a gift? What is the definition of a gift? On our birthdays, do we demand presents? You must give me a present, it's my birthday. If it's given because it has to be, it's not a gift, it's an ungift. Okay? It's an obligation, it's not a gift. A gift, by definition, is something given freely, but also something that may or may not happen. Okay? And moreover, a gift, beyond being a blessing, okay, can only be given by the one who possesses the gift. So when we're talking about the gift of human life, if we recognize it's wrong for one human person to possess another and use another, then who's the author of a human? Who possesses a human person? Okay. As Christians, as Catholics, we would recognize God, okay, the Creator. He's the one who has the gift, right? And as I mentioned, there was that surrogate mother, true story, American woman named Stephanie Levesque. Again, when the child she was carrying was discovered to have heart problems, the parents wanted the child to be aborted, but she refused, carried the pregnancy to term. And here's what she said. She said, it's the most beautiful gift you could ever give. All right? Now, granted, surrogacy, still morally wrong. Okay, that's another harm. I don't think I actually, did I get that on? I think I missed that on the harm. Again, surrogacy, still morally wrong. Gets to the harms to the human person. But again, nonetheless, we see that even as she missed the point with regard to the wrong of surrogacy, she gets half credit because she recognizes that life is a gift, that it is God's gift. All right. But here's the other question. She also goes on to add that she's writing a book on joy. She says, giving families a baby they never thought they'd have. What a great gift. I'm giving families a baby they never thought they'd have. But it begs the question, is it hers to give? All right. Again, is it hers to give? Ultimately, we recognize that God is the only one who has the authority to give the gift because he is ultimately the author of life. Now, we can create the conditions materially But again, the human person, body and soul, God infuses the soul. All right. Um, and she gives a nice example. If a child sees a toy in a store and you overhear the parents tell the child can't have it because he can't afford it, you decide to gift the toy to the child. He may be delighted that you have it, but imagine you didn't purchase the toy, that you stole it. Okay? As much as the child is delighted, you didn't really have the right to give the gift. And that's really the question we're talking about with IVF and these reproductive technologies. All right? Do we have the right to create life? All right, and that is the key question. All right. Now, the child, again, has rights. We talk about the parental rights. They have the right to basically protect the goods of the child. And what are the goods of the child? The child has two things: the right to life by the very nature of his existence or her existence, okay? But also that right to the loving environment of parents, right? Why do we have the Department of Child and Family Services? To ensure that there's a loving environment for the child. And when that isn't present, okay, then there's intervention to prevent harm to the child. Again, so in a similar way, the child has the right to be protected from harm. Parents have the right to protect the rights of the child, but they do not, because they are not the authors of life, they do not have the right to seek a child at any cost. Right? And that's not meant to be cruel to those who struggle with infertility. As I said, it's an awful cross. The good news is there is hope. All right? But before we get to that hope, we have to look at what are the consequences that accompany the choice of in vitro fertilization. What comes with in vitro fertilization? Okay. There are basically 5 reasons that we as Christians reject in vitro fertilization. Okay. We've talked about the fact that it violates the nature of parenthood and the responsibility of mothers and fathers to ensure the safety of their offspring. All right, and that's because of some of the other harms that happen. Okay, IVF. The second, I guess, really the first, IVF harms and kills some human beings. Okay, as a result of that, it violates the nature of parenthood and the responsibility of mothers and fathers to ensure the safety and protection of offspring. Now, you might ask, well, if a child is born, how does it harm and kill some human beings? We have to ask the question, what happens to the children left behind? What happens to the children left behind? Usually they implant 1 or 2 embryos. There are certain other situations where they may implant more, maybe even up to 5 or 6. Okay. But what happens to all the others? All right. Let's ask Paris Hilton. Okay. This is Paris Hilton, for those of you who do not know, had a couple children now by in vitro fertilization. There she is. Okay. Oh, cripes. Did I just miss it? I missed my marker. Well, she talks about the boys. I have all boys. I keep having boys. 21 boys. Okay. Right now she has 1. She's 1 boy, 1 girl. Okay, she has one boy. Where are the rest? They're on ice. Okay. What happens to those children left behind? Okay. A lot of times they're abandoned. There was a report from NBC down in Fort Myers, fertility clinic doctor, saying how about 21% of the embryos at his clinic were simply abandoned by the parents. They just never responded. Kind of just they sit there frozen in limbo, and what do we do with them? Okay. As of this time, the Catholic Church hasn't been able to find a moral way to deal with them. Some may say, well, what about embryo adoption? Well, first of all, you're now engaging in vitro fertilization, an immoral act. Okay, what we ultimately will come to see is an immoral act. But then also, you're now encouraging in vitro fertilization, because the industry will just look at it and say, well, we'll just give them to the Christians. We'll give them to those who will adopt, But again, estimates are, there was, I forget which journal it's cited in here, like biotechnology, fertility, something like that. 90,000, okay, is what the doctor estimated. There are many other studies that say that could be in the millions of children on ice. All right. Now, the other option that is offered, okay, is so they may be frozen and then at some future time thawed and brought to full life. All right. But then the other option is the embryos can be donated to science, to scientific research, which is helpful to us. But it's not very helpful to the embryos whose lives will be ended. Okay? And when we think about the horror of the experiments in World War II and the Holocaust, even in some of the outrage at experiments that were done on African Americans in our own country without their consent. Okay, why are we outraged? Because again, they're experimenting on a human person, treating a human person as an object. Okay, treating a human person as an object. That's a key principle. Since a person is a gift and has intrinsic value, they may not be treated as an object. All right. So again, if we're outraged at the horrific experiments by the Nazis in World War II, why should we not be similarly upset about experimenting on embryos for the sake of medical advancements? It, if nothing else, begs the question, what is the preborn? What is the embryo? Again, that's a different talk. You can see Stephanie's first book, Love Unleashes Life, to see the evidence for the case of embryo as a person. But, even our culture has recognized this, okay? As much as our president is pushing this good thing, it does beg the question of, are we reducing persons to objects? You may remember a couple years ago, the Alabama Supreme Court case ruled that a couple could sue the fertility clinic because there was a careless coworker went into the freezer, accidentally dropped the embryos of this couple. Okay, vials broke, the embryos, the children were lost, and the couple wanted to sue for negligence. Okay, sue for damages. Okay. Again, when we look at it, it's kind of a sort of commodification of the human person, a reducing the person to a product. You broke my product, I want damages. Okay? But what's even more horrific is Alabama's legislature very quickly came back and passed a bill giving immunity to any fertility clinic where there was the loss of embryos based on similar situations. Can you imagine any other place where you'd say, well, yeah, if you accidentally murder someone, that's okay. You don't have to worry about it. Okay? There is involuntary manslaughter, which is certainly a lesser charge, but nonetheless, there's trial and consequences. All right? But what happens to those that aren't to be kept for later, that aren't to be used for scientific research? What happens if the couple just doesn't want them? If they are just abandoned? Well, if they are just abandoned and left behind after a certain point, or at the request of the parents, they're simply discarded. Okay, and Stephanie documents a situation where a couple just had a bunch, they've been sitting for a while, and they thought, well, yeah, just go ahead and discard them. If we decide we want more children by in vitro fertilization later, we'll just make new ones. Again, you see the reducing of the human person to a manufactured product. Right? This is one of the primary reasons the Catholic Church opposes in vitro fertilization. All right? What happens if they implant 5 embryos and they all are fertilized, or if they implant 2 embryos but only one child is desired? How do we deal with that situation? Well, the common response in the medical community is selective reduction, which is exactly what it sounds like. Select which ones you don't want, and we'll discard the rest. Abortion. Okay? And that happens very commonly, sometimes even in situations where a couple unexpectedly have twins. Sometimes they'll offer, do you want to selectively reduce one of the children in order to give the other a better chance of survival? Okay. So again, the selective discarding of excessive embryos, but also those with genetic anomalies or of the undesired sex. Okay, so there's a very eugenics mentality behind this. All right, there are companies out there that will promise you, yes, we will select to get you all the traits you want, the blue eyes, the make sure you get the boy or the girl you want. So there are all these companies out there selecting for certain traits in the child. They promise the healthiest. Okay, but also that's a part of the process as well. Okay, you know how when we go to the store, we have different grades of the eggs. We got grade A, grade AA, jumbo. They also do the same when they create embryos by in vitro fertilization. They always look to see which ones are most likely to survive, and then they will freeze the others, okay, in case they want them later. But again, which parent is going to go, yes, we'll take the less desirable ones this time versus the more likely to survive? Again, rarely happens. All right, so what you get is a sort of selective eugenics mentality, designing the best and most fit. And God only knows if the lessers will survive or if they'll just simply be discarded. Then there's the harm of pornography. Okay, we know pornography certainly contributes to human trafficking throughout the world, but pornography is, the primary means by which the male gametes are obtained. Okay, they give the man a little jar, put him into a room where there is plenty of material available for him to take care of things. All right, so you've got not only the sin of pornography, but the sin of masturbation going on. So again, all these sins in order to accomplish the good of the life of a child, right? But then there's the, unintended consequences, the harms towards living human beings, right? Uh, for, surrogate mothers, right? Those who act as surrogates. What are we doing now? Again, we're taking an adult human person and basically reducing them to an incubator, reducing them to a piece of machinery, a means to an end, okay, if you will, a rentable, which is a terrible indignity, regardless of how it's framed, okay? Um, but then there's the harms to the children born via in vitro fertilization. Right? There are a number of support groups out there for those who were conceived through donor egg or donor sperm, don't know their parents. There's grief, there's uncertainty and anxiety at times. One kept asking her mom, "Who's my dad? I want to know my dad." And mom kept telling her, "Well, it doesn't matter." And so she began to wonder, well, if my parents don't matter, if my dad doesn't matter, do I matter? Again, similar anxieties and struggles. Uh, then there's the harm of potential sibling marriage. Some wonder, what if, I end up marrying someone who's actually my, half brother, half sister. Okay? And while it may seem just a fear or hypothetical, there's actually been a documented case where actually happened. Uh, here it is. Is that? Yeah, the a man and his wife were raised by lesbian mothers. The wife was very curious about her father, and so she contacted the sperm bank where he contributed and found out uh, her paternity, who her father was. And this was important to her because she wanted to know her genetic roots for the sake of the children they would have. Again, the right to know their full medical history. Again, if the donor is unknown, there may be health complications they're unaware of. The husband didn't really have an interest, but as a present to his wife, he decided that eventually he would find his genetic father. So he went and did the same thing, contacted the sperm bank, and was horrified to find out that he and his wife had the same dad. And as he wrote, "I can't help but think this is my sister every time I look at her." Okay? As Joe said, it's the Luke Skywalker, in the Return of the Jedi. Ugh, I kissed my sister. Um, but again, these are very real harms, right? And things that we can't just dismiss under the rug. Um, So you see, ultimately, what ends up happening with IVF, although it starts with good intention, it ends up reducing human persons to commodities, to products versus gifts to be received, as things that are manufactured and produced versus things that are given by God and also given in the right way. Okay, so basically, gametes, donors, surrogates, they simply get reduced to raw material or machinery for this product to be produced. But then the other big objection is that in vitro fertilization divorces sex, marital intimacy, from the creation of life. It separates love making from life giving. Right? It replaces the married couple's one flesh union with a scientist, with at least as regards the beginnings of the child's life. Right? In fact, you don't even need marital intimacy at all. Okay? Don't want to carry the child? Again, you can take the Paris Hilton route. She and her husband simply had in vitro fertilization done, created the embryos, and hired a surrogate. She never even carried her child. And then I can remember reading about the pain of the surrogate mother as soon as the child was born, she didn't even have a chance to hold her child, immediately taken, wrapped up, and given to Paris, who was in a bed for some reason, even though she wanted the experience, she just didn't want the difficulty. So again, you can see the difficulty of that. But as Catholics, as Christians, as anyone of right reason who recognizes the natural law, there is a meaning to marital intimacy, to the sexual act. All right, the coming together as a one flesh union actually promotes bonding and offers the potential for babies. Every time marital intimacy happens, there are chemicals released in the body, oxytocin. It's a hormone that promotes bonding. It's also released at birth, makes things seem not quite so bad, promotes bonding with whoever the person is that they're with. So again, good for mother and child, also good for husband and wife to strengthen that marital union. And then we've already talked about how mortal sin gets introduced in order to obtain the male gametes. But again, it opens the way for almost anyone to create a child. You may remember a couple months back the viral video about the same-sex couple country singer and the child crying out for mom. And no mom, just dad. Again, harm denying the child the right to a mother and a father. And you see even single moms. In the book, Stephanie talks about a woman, child conceived by a single mother who simply wanted to have a child to fulfill her own fantasies and selfish needs. And she, again, treated the child very badly, treated her as an object to be used for her own personal needs and pleasures, caused great damage and harm to the psyche of the young woman who felt used, not loved. Again, all this is made possible by in vitro fertilization. But finally, we recognize that it violates God's natural law of husband and wife coming together in a private and intimate communion of persons. Again, in vitro fertilization introduces that third person, right? And then to receive that child as a gift, not a guarantee. But what about those couples that struggle with infertility? All right, what possible options are available? There is, for years, some of you may be familiar with the St. Paul Center for Reproductive Health at Creighton University, founded by Dr. Hilgers, who is the creator not only of the Creighton fertility care method of natural family planning, but also, as a result of ongoing research and looking at problems that women were having with their cycles and other problems conceiving, developed a whole system of assessing the underlying conditions and problems and healing them, called Natural Procreative Technology, NAPRO for short. Okay. Similarly, in Ireland, there's a clinic called Neofertility, and again, they speak of their process as restorative reproductive medicine. Okay, really, you could kind of think of all of these as really restorative reproductive medicine. And what do we mean by that? All right, it's an approach to reproductive medicine that uses medical and surgical techniques to identify and correct underlying medical problems, such as poor ovulation, inadequate hormones, immune factors. All right, so it doesn't bypass reproductive health, but rather seeks to restore, normalize, optimize reproductive function for men and women. Okay, so it heals and restores the underlying causes rather than simply seeing the symptoms and working around them, which is what IVF does. All right. And what's really interesting is in 2017, there was a comparison of the IVF success. The average was around 26%, but the neofertility's success in live birth rate was actually 53.6. Right? And if you look at the stats for the NAPRO technology, you'll find similar statistics that compared to secular techniques, the common techniques, um, the again restorative reproductive medicine of NAPRO was equal or better than what was out there. So again, there is hope. And as you heard me talk about Stephanie's story in the beginning, um, she herself struggled with the low progesterone levels. She also, at the end of the book, shares a lot of stories of a lot of different women with a lot of different reproductive health issues, all of whom were helped. Nevertheless, there are situations where there is no option, there is no restoration. And some will have to bear the cross of infertility for life. But that doesn't mean their life is without end or without meaning. In the end, Stephanie also shares a couple of stories, especially of a friend who used her life to help children throughout the world. She became an evangelist, bringing the gospel to children and serving and teaching children throughout the world. And in that way, she had a spiritual family, spiritual children. All right. Kind of not unlike priest and consecrated when rightly lived. Again, the reason that you call me father is because I'm striving to live a spiritual fatherhood with you as my spiritual children. So again, there are many ways to have a meaningful life, even if, because of the reality of original sin in the world, the cross of infertility has come upon you. So again, to summarize, why is the church opposed to in vitro fertilization? Okay. Simply because when you look at it, in vitro fertilization first harms and kills some human beings. It involves practices that violate the nature of parenthood and the responsibility of mothers and fathers to ensure the safety and protection of their offspring. It treats humans as products or commodities instead of gifts to be received. It divorces sex, marital intimacy, from the creation of life, and finally violates God's natural law of the husband and wife coming together in that private, intimate communion of persons to receive the child as a gift, not a right. Thank you for your time, and if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to take them.